Right. Cool. So as we know, the paper was titled Peak Week Recommendations for Bodybuilders, an Evidence-Based Approach by Escalante et al. 2021. Bill Campbell was a co-author on this, so that kind of made me pay attention to it in the first place. But yes, I'm just going to read part of the abstract anyway, because it is a very good summary of what the whole paper was about. So bodybuilding is a competitive endeavor where a combination of muscle size, symmetry, conditioning, quote unquote, and stage presentation are judged. Success in bodybuilding requires that competitors achieve their peak physique during the day of competition. To this end, competitors have been reported to employ various peaking interventions during the final days leading to competition. Commonly reported peaking strategies include altering exercise and nutritional regimes, including manipulation of nutrients, water, and electrolyte intake, as well as consumption of various dietary supplements. The primary goal for these interventions are to maximize muscle glycogen content, minimize subcutaneous water, so the water under the skin, and to reduce the risk of abdominal bloating to bring about a more aesthetically pleasing physique. Unfortunately, there is a dearth of evidence to support the commonly reported practices employed by bodybuilders during peak week. Hence, the purpose of that particular article was to critically review the current literature as to the specific support for pre-contest peaking protocols most commonly employed by bodybuilders, and to provide evidence-based recommendations as safe and effective strategies on the topic. So first point I also want to make, and I mean the categories in bodybuilding are different depending on the federation, etc., or even country-wise. I don't think in Germany something like fitness exists where people also have to do physical like tasks or like a dance or whatever, push-ups or backflip or whatever, that we don't have, but we do have various categories as well. And so for instance, in something like bikini, as you can see in the picture there, certain strategies are not used very frequently, so like water or sodium manipulation, because you don't actually want to have that hard look. You don't want to look that muscular. Whereas in categories like bodybuilding per se, or in the higher like maybe even in, no, I don't think figure, but women's physique or whatever, you might be employing that. I'm not sure. But firstly, Mike, maybe you want to share with us also what you or I don't know if you think it's more appropriate later on, what your peak week looked like.
I have a question. What is the order of the categories, like from muscularity to like more model-like? Because I never know that.
Well, it kind of depends again on the federation what categories they even have, and maybe Mike, you can insert here as well to your knowledge. But one federation that I'm slightly more familiar with is called NPC. Don't ask me what it stands for. But their bikini is like the least muscular that you can be. So this is what you're seeing there. Then the next one is a new category that they called wellness. It has a little bit more leg volume, but the upper body is largely the same. It's also a little bit more advantageous for women that are just generally shorter. And then the next one is figure, which is a bit more of hourglass. So it does get more into like the lats and bigger upper body. And then after that, I think women's physique, and then after that, bodybuilding. So that's like the categorization for women. Now Mike, maybe you can tell us about the categories in the on the men's side.
Yeah, and you pretty much got it spot on. Sorry for any background noise. I think just to add a slight complexity to that as well, like in some categories, they're even splitting it up even more, so that, say, for example, figure, you've got like trained figure and toned figure and stuff like that. So again, I think because there's so many it's so hard to, in bodybuilding, it's quite simple. Like you're the leanest you can be and the most muscular you can be. Whereas in, I guess, kind of like female physique, they're trying to account for all the different types of leanness and body shapes and so on. So they're just kind of separating it out there. But in terms of the sort of men's categories, so yeah, you've got bodybuilding, which is essentially you're trying to be as lean as you can be, as well developed from a symmetrical perspective, and so on. Now, you also have classic physique, where maybe the conditioning isn't quite the same depending on what federation, and it's more of a, if you think of like the Arnold Schwarzenegger era, it's much more akin to that. So you've got kind of like normal bodybuilding, as it were, and then you've got classic, which is
So
more
normal bodybuilding would be more muscular than or harder, so to speak, than classic physique, right?
correct, yeah. So you'd probably see in classic physique, it'd be maybe slightly softer, very marginally, depending on the, because I mean, if you looked at like the Mr. Olympia, you probably wouldn't be able to tell a difference. They're probably just as hard in both categories, but in some natural federations, they would probably say they don't award conditioning to the same degree as normal bodybuilding, if that makes sense.
So CBUM is classic physique, right?
Correct, yeah.
And then below that you have just physique or men. That's where they still wear the board shorts and stuff. Where, like, for instance, Cody McBroom from Tailored Coaching Method, when he was competing, was at where he was the category he was competing at.
Yeah, so exactly right. So you've got men's physique, which is where they wear the board shorts. So conditioning maybe might be slightly different, but honestly, it really depends because you can get some males that are just absolutely shredded to the bone. So again, it really does. It depends. Sometimes they can be just as conditioned as the men's bodybuilding categories. It just depends sometimes. Theoretically, they might not be as conditioned, though, in theory.
Okay, cool. Did that help a little bit, Melissa? So essentially, the most muscular of each side is always the where the category is actually called bodybuilding or
It
bodybuilder.
ended up for me in it depends. Melissa, Google it.
I guess, but I guess the still the broader overview is if it's
Yeah,
called like bodybuilding or women's bodybuilding, that's the most muscular category, and the least muscular category for the women is usually bikini, and for the men is physique, men's physique. So
Okay, so then would be bikini for woman, then it would be wellness, then would
yeah,
be figure, and then bodybuilding.
there's women's physique or something like that between figure and bodybuilding. Sometimes, not all federations, but
It
sometimes.
depends.
Yeah. The other note,
Okay.
the other note I made here is that, at least that was in the article, that common prep durations are between 8 and 22 plus weeks. I think 8 is really, 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 really little. That's probably for someone like in between shows type of thing. I'm much more familiar with, hearing about 14 at the very least to up to like 26 weeks. Of course, that depends on how much body fat you accumulated in your off season also. But yes, I would say that that's generally more along that line. And Mike,
That
how?
also be the case for first timers?
Yeah, most of the time. Like when I last year, when I said to, or when I was contemplating to step on stage, she would have had me do a 23-week prep. Yeah. So for anybody, yep. And Mike, how long was your prep phase?
Ooh, it was like 26 weeks.
Okay, yeah. So
Yeah, so
fairly
I started I started in March, and my first competition was in September.
right. Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yeah, it's more on the other side. It's like you both are already up. So if you take someone like Gen Pop and has to achieve this level of muscularity, it's not enough 26 weeks. So that was what I was
No,
thinking that
I
it
know,
is because all you're trying to do, you're just getting lean essentially. However much muscle mass you've got is how much muscle mass you've got. It's just a case of getting lean.
Yeah, so because my reaction was the same. I was like, really, I don't feel like I have that much body fat to lose. And she was like, well, if you're on the leaner side, we are gonna go slightly more moderate. But I mean, I shared with you what her protocol was going to be for me anyway. That was her moderate approach. And I assume if you are a little bit bigger, she would probably put you in like a 600 calorie deficit straight away, sort of thing. So yeah, that's probably the difference.
Yeah, I think it's just I have zero contact with this world. So for me, this is all firsthand. That's why the paper was interesting for me because I read it in Menno's course as, a class, but I've never met anyone or follow anyone except Natalie in YouTube. But I don't have any idea. So I didn't know that it's like you take a Gen Pop and you just make them as lean as possible. I thought you had to gain muscle before. So yeah,
Ideally, of course. But like I mean, prep is only considered from when you're in a diet. Anything before that is called your off season. So prep you only consider dieting phase. That's not, I mean, like from a term, I get what you're saying because technically building muscle is part of a prep also. But like anywhere where you're in maintenance or in a surplus, that's not considered prep. So, oh, yes, let's go to the next slide and dive right into it. Basically, I'm not going to muck around too long since it's long anyway, but the first thing that's usually obviously manipulated throughout the prep or specifically peak week is what I want to focus on is carbs. So generally speaking, lowering carbs and raising fat intake as tolerable during peak week training, so depletion days may facilitate glycogen loading during the days after training and simultaneously ensure intramuscular triglyceride levels are not lowered excessively. So as we know, obviously, like carbs bind to water and carbs make the muscles look fuller. But if we deplete them first and then after 1 to 2 days of loading glycogen mid or late of the peak week. So most of the time competitions are on Saturdays. In this paper, they assumed anyway that they're on Saturdays. So in this approach, that then means that intramuscular triglyceride levels could then be elevated the day before competition with a high fat, low carb approach that would also serve to reduce body water. Once again, the individual variability in athlete goals or needs may require different strategies with these general guidelines. I do like that he highlighted that, or they highlighted that several times in the paper, that still individuality is very important. But so according to this, initially in the week, we're going to lower carbs, then bring them back up, and then the day before, lower carbs again a little bit, not a lot, but a little bit, and bringing fats up to work with that intramuscular triglyceride level. I do think that adjustment in fat is not always a given. I think many people just manipulate carbs. But yeah, again, I'm sorry if I'm picking on you, Mike, but I'm just curious to hear what your peak week approaches in terms of carbs were most of the time.
Yeah, no worries. So actually, my peak week was probably the simplest, and you could maybe even call it boring ever. So leading into the peak week, so if you think Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday were exactly my normal diet, and then Thursday we increased the carbohydrates. We didn't change anything with regards to water or salt. That was kept completely the same, and we just increased carbohydrates. We reassessed how I was looking, and if I was looking better and I wasn't looking worse in the sense of, maybe I'm looking like I've eaten a little bit too much, what they kind of termed spilled over, where you kind of almost have like a little bit too much. And as long as things were looking okay, we maybe made a small increase in the carbohydrates, and we just did that on Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and then the day of the competition was just a normal diet day,
Oh,
essentially.
interesting. Okay, yeah. So
And
very
that was it.
minimal manipulations. And I mean, I have heard that in recent years it is actually more common not to manipulate water or sodium just because you tend to be a little bit more on the safe side with that, whereas the traditional approach did include a lot more sodium and water manipulation. And but this was the first time that well, I had heard about the manipulation of fat as well, and even protein. But yeah, so I find it super interesting how different it is. And I mean, they mentioned in the paper several times also that it's really worth having like a practice peak week, maybe 4 weeks or so before the show, just to see how your body responds best.
Yeah, absolutely. I also I hadn't heard of um, manipulating fats until Steve Hall tried it in his last prep, and but that was the first time I heard of it as well, and it kind of made sense. He anecdotally, Steve Hall said he felt that it wasn't quite as good for him as manipulating carbohydrates, but again,
So he did that in exchange for manipulating carbs, or both, like in conjunction, as they are suggesting here.
yeah, so it's a good question. And I think the way he did it at the time was he only manipulated fats.
Oh,
I
okay,
don't
gotcha.
think he manipulated both. So
Okay,
it would be
interesting.
interesting to see if he did that strategy.
Cool. Okay. Yeah, just adding on to this, so they also said rather than introducing new foods during peak week, consuming mainly the same dietary constituents during peak week as those consumed during the preceding weeks and months beforehand may also be helpful in avoiding gastric distress. That kind of makes sense. Since fruit and fructose sources of carbohydrates better stimulate liver glycogen restoration, whereas glucose does so for muscle glycogen. It is recommended that the majority of the carbs consumed come from starchy glucose-based sources. Of note, however, is that combinations of glucose, fructose, and sucrose with sports drinks have been shown to enhance the rate of fluid absorption from the proximal small intestine. Thus, it is recommended that athletes experiment prior to peak week as to what carbohydrate source works best for them. And then, yeah, into protein, ensuring that protein is co-ingested. So again, this pertains to peak week, albeit in perhaps lower quantities, with carbs may increase insulin release and facilitate glycogen loading. Front loading versus back loading. So that kind of goes into what they touched on with regards to carbs. So front loading would be increasing carbs early in the week and then tapering off. Backloading would be reducing carbs early in the week and then increasing them later on in the week. So I guess, Mike, yours would be kind of considered more backloading since nothing was changed with your carbs until day 3 or 4 or 5.
Yeah, it was interesting because we, or Steve and me, we've kind of talked about it as a tiny little bit more of a front loading approach. But to
Okay.
be honest, the way that it's described in the paper and the way, like we mentioned it, it does kind of lend itself a little bit more to a backloading type approach. But again, like Cliff Wilson, he would often talk about, you have like you have like a rapid backloading approach where maybe you might only manipulate carbohydrates 24 hours before and you do like a really drastic intervention, whereas you might have a very slow backload approach and so on and so forth. So again, there's probably nuances in there, and yeah, I'm probably the strategy that I used was probably a bit of a mixture maybe.
Yeah, no, it sounds interesting. And when I was talking to Cliff Wilson in our podcast interview, he did mention a little bit about those strategies. And I mean, some of the amounts of the loading are really astonishing to me. I mean, something like, let's say a female normally, like towards the end of her prep, she might be on 80 or 100 grams of carbs. And then, or maybe a little bit more, but maybe that, I don't know. And then you might like quadruple that from one day to the next, literally, so that glycogen storages actually fill up. But like for some men, like Cliff Wilson, he mentioned some people he would load on like 1,500 grams of carbs, like literally. How
Yeah.
do you eat all of that? I mean, that's a crap ton of rice, even if you just eat rice, which is, I mean, reasonably digestible. Um,
Powders,
pardon? Powder.
powders.
Yeah, of
That's what they
course.
were saying. You use the powders
Of
to
course, too.
to allow you to consume this huge amount of food
But
without
yeah, it's
causing
still
gastric distension.
astonishing to me anyway, but just to give like context, because sometimes when I think like, oh, a high carb day, low carb day, you know, normally if we're talking about carb cycling, that might be a difference of like, let it be 100, but not to those kind of extents, and yeah, I think it's quite interesting.
Lisa,
Um,
I was really astonished by this. So recently there's a person in my gym who's enhanced and he uses drugs, but his carbohydrate manipulation, I'm not kidding you, we're talking in the tens of thousands of grams of carbs. I was like, I literally asked what you said. I was like, how did you get all of that in? And he was just like, Rice Krispie cakes, and like you said, rice and Lucozade. That was
mhm.
pretty much it.
Wow, that's insane. That's seriously insane.
And I was literally like, what? How? I couldn't even like comprehend how many carbohydrates that was. So
And I assume he's not like obese.
no, no, far from. Yeah.
That's crazy. Wow. Right, okay. So a higher protein intake, so for example, 3 grams per kg, may be combined with a higher fat intake during periods of carbohydrate depletion to initiate fat loading followed by carbohydrate loading. So for instance, those early days of the week, so Monday, Tuesday, for example, with a lower protein intake during the carbohydrate loading to supercompensate glycogen stores. Once carbohydrate loading is complete, a higher protein intake, higher protein, lower carb diet may be implemented. Once again, individual variability and athlete goals needs may require different strategies to peak the physique. And also reducing fiber intake during peak week appears to offer some potential benefits, of course, to minimize bloating, etc., and even just your stomach extension from having a lot in it, essentially. So now water and sodium manipulation. This, by the way, is Caroline when she was competing many years ago, my former colleague. But anyway, many variables may alter the approach used to water load and water deplete. For example, that means how much water the athlete is accustomed to drinking on a regular basis. But the participants in a previous study successfully lost total body weight by drinking a large quantity of water, so 100 milliliters per kg. So that's quite a lot. Yeah, that would be like 5.5 or 6 liters for me. So yes, that's a ton. And for 3 days, followed by significantly cutting water. Yes, that's a huge drop on the fourth day with no deleterious effects. Alternatively, water intake can be kept relatively constant with the exception of a few hours before competing to prevent any abdominal distension to minimize the variables being manipulated. Indeed, this might be the best approach if no practice runs are performed prior to competing. Furthermore, since muscle glycogen creates an osmotic effect, pulling water into the cells as glycogen is stored, carb loading should be carried out in conjunction with water intake so that muscle what does it stand for? Intracellular water? Yes,
Yeah.
can be maximized while carb intake is high. After approximately 3 days of water loading with a higher carb intake, if the water loading method is used, water intake can decrease, as we mentioned, and which will help to induce diuresis within the 24 hours prior to the competition. Note that this recommendation is based on what has been studied and reported. However, the authors recognize that higher water intakes may be preferential, but have not been investigated and thus require further research. Increasing or maintaining a high protein intake while lowering carbohydrate consumption and concomitantly increasing fat intake during the day before competing conceivably would reverse unwanted gains in extracellular subcutaneous water experienced during carbohydrate loading. So sometimes when people talk about like cleaning up because someone spilled over a couple of days before, and we'll again go into what the spilling over, etc., means a little bit later on. So that could be a strategy used to quote unquote clean up. Another one on water and sodium. So sodium intake should not be reduced simultaneously with carb loading, since evidence suggests that the delivery of carbs is limited by the transport capacity of SGLT1. I forget what that one was called. Something transport, sodium something glucose
Sodium
transport one.
glucose, sodium glucose transporter. So you need a transporter that transports both of them, I think.
Yep. Once carb intake has decreased after glycogen loading, sodium intake may be temporarily reduced. Alternatively, sodium can be kept as a constant to minimize the variables being manipulated. Indeed, this might be the best approach if no practice runs are performed prior to competing. Storage and retention of muscle glycogen is highly dependent on potassium availability as well, a primary intracellular patient. Hence, ensuring adequate potassium intake during both carbohydrate loading and water cutting procedures, if implemented, is likely paramount to optimizing stage appearance via storage and retention of muscle glycogen, and thus encouraging a more favorable loss of extracellular water relative to intracellular water when employing dehydration strategies. So really kind of getting into the nitty-gritty of it. Now coming into the supplements. So Melissa, you already touched on carbohydrate powders. I won't read all of that, but some herbal diuretics have been used, like dandelion tea, etc., to enhance the excretion of water. And of course, creatine is also used or varied sometimes during peak week as well. Now into the training. And we'll take a look at that overview of all the macronutrients later on as well, which I really thought was a very good picture. But first, in regards to training, so during a depletion or a super compensation resistance exercise protocol, resistance exercise should engage all major muscle groups and employ a variety of exercises to ensure widespread reduction in intramuscular triglycerides and glycogen levels across the entire muscle mass. So that would be used earlier on in the week. Using a relatively high repetition scheme, so more than 12 reps with either a lower or higher volume approach, and exerting enough effort and or load to engage most muscle fibers, but stopping short of failure and employing a training volume intensity taper while avoiding novel exercises seems prudent to ensure muscle damage is minimized. Exercises that overload the muscle in their lengthened range are eccentric dominant, for example, Romanian deadlifts, dumbbell lat pullovers, dumbbell flies, and should be minimized since training at lengthened positions has been shown to increase muscle damage. So I've heard many times that people will stop training actually the 2 days before completely, and maybe have their last leg day or heavy leg day like on the Sunday or so if they're competing on Saturday, and then only doing really light training the first 3 days of the week. And then of course on the day, we're going to talk about that, on the day they're kind of like pumping up. That's what they call it often. But yeah, you really want to make sure that you're not seeing any inflammation from hard training on when you're stepping on stage, or yeah, just the days before even. Cardiovascular exercise should also be tapered and preferentially eliminated before attempting to supercompensate fuel stores dietarily in these days preceding competition. Resistance training during peak week should generally take place early in the week, spread out over 3 to 4 days, depending on the athlete's accustomed training split, to allow adequate time for compensation during the days before stepping on the competition platform. Training legs first in a series of peak week workouts allows the greatest time for recovery in these muscle groups. Mike, I'm curious what your pumping up looked like on the day. So I know that often backstage, all they have is smaller dumbbells and people mostly bring bands, I guess, or do push-ups or that kind of stuff. But yeah, how did you pump up before stepping on stage?
Yeah, so certainly in the competitions that I competed in last year, there was no equipment backstage at all. So it's down to the competitors' discretion to bring their own things. So I just used bands and my body weight, and it was basically a circuit of I did like I did some banded lateral raises, I did some banded bent over rows, some push-ups, bicep curls, and then like maybe some tricep dips or something like that. And then I just rotated around that maybe sort of 2 or 3 times and just allowed myself, didn't tie myself out too much, but just try to get myself warm. Something that I uniquely experienced was that I actually you can sometimes get quite cold because not only obviously are very lean, but if you're kind of sitting around waiting to go on stage and they've got like air conditioning and stuff like that, you can get quite cold. And actually, it's quite nice to pump up to get warm to increase a bit of the vascularity and so on. So that was certainly something that it was useful for from my perspective as well.
Nice. And it's probably a fine line because you don't want to get a sweat on, given that you're like spray tanned and everything. And then,
Exactly.
like, especially for the girls, you have your bikini and everything in place already. It's glued onto your skin, so you don't want to move all too much. Um,
Exactly.
yeah, no, that makes sense.
Did you just say glued on?
Yeah, your bikini is like literally spray glued, or like probably not just the bikini. I assume it's the same with the little pants that guys have, but they're like spray glued on essentially because you don't want that to move. I mean, you're walking on stage basically rather
Half
naked
naked.
already. Imagine that bikini just slides like a tiny bit and you see stuff you don't want to be seen. So
Oh
that's not ideal.
God.
No, so that's actually not what we did, by the way.
Okay, not for you.
So
Okay, yes,
yeah,
yes,
super
okay.
quick scroll. So for the guys at least, you basically just wear a sock, and then you get sprayed, and then when it comes to like just before you step on stage, you put your trunks on, and then out you go.
Okay, so the trunks are not glued on at all in your case.
No.
Now I
Okay.
understood the sock picture of
Yeah, so
Tom.
that's Tom's sock.
Yeah, well, sorry, I don't know what that was for.
He
Oh,
did say he'd leave it up to the imagination.
The backstage, oh my God, how that was gonna look, everybody walking there with their sock.
And obviously, like, you're wearing baggy clothes. It's just for because you get spray tanned. It's like Ross from Friends, basically. So you go in this like little tent, and then someone with the spray tan sprays you down everywhere. And then when you've had all your coats, you put your baggy clothes back on, and then off you go.
That's awesome. Well,
Melissa's
and
just
I
like,
mean, Melissa, I mean, the whole
My head
shaving.
is exploding.
We're not even going to talk about the whole like shaving procedures and
oh no,
whatnot. Like you like literally have to shave everything, every part of your body. At least as a woman, I
everywhere.
don't know.
Well,
But
I
I mean,
mean, the
otherwise,
guys also, because this little thing that they wear is tiny.
well, that. But I mean, I'm not just talking like down there. I'm talking about like literally your back, or like even for
Yeah.
someone who doesn't have like for me, I would shave my arms because otherwise the color doesn't stick the same way as it does for on other parts of my body. So you literally have to shave everything. Yeah. So
I'm still not past the glue spray. Like this is still sticking on me. Like the bikini is glued to you.
well,
Removing
I
that,
I
oh
would
God.
rather that than suddenly something showing that you don't want to
And how do
show.
you remove it after?
Well, I mean, it's not like permanent glue. It's just
Have you been in the hospital when they remove that stuff from your skin? That
I
hurts. Unless the arm.
I can imagine it might not feel super pleasant. Yes. Oh, all right. So let's get more into the practical applications that they gave. It is important to emphasize that these recommendations should not be considered concrete rules, as there is significant individual variability of how athletes may respond to the manipulation of these variables. Emotionally stressful situations can evoke polydyspia and alter fluid homeostasis in as little as 48 hours. I like that they mentioned that because like really stress management during that week is super important too. And like I think, I mean, of course, that's not the main reason, but often you see pictures of like people waiting for their turn on competitions and they lay down specifically course to keep everything in place, but also to just like relax and keep the stress level as low as possible. Um, Performing a practice run of the peak week strategy 2 to 4 weeks before the actual competition, and part of to reduce that anxiety and to assure the competitor that the peak week strategy is both manageable and effective is recommended. It's essential to understand that none of the aforementioned peak week strategies will provide a physique makeover to compensate for a lack of preparation or adherence during the off-season or pre-contest phases of contest preparation. I think that's super important because people sometimes think peak week strategies can be magic, but if you can't show off something that you don't have, right? So even if you're stripping everything down. So yeah, I loved this graphic overview thingy where it's basically yeah, everything that we talked about in regards to carb or fat loading or carb depletion here, then you're carbing up and then you're drying out, and what that means in terms of fat as well, and in terms, I guess I don't know if they put, oh no, they put it in protein here. So reducing protein, protein up, far fat down, fat up. So yeah, I think this is a really, really, really great overview. And of course, there's also difference in regards to weight restricted athletes and others that compete in open categories. And then here we have the overview of training, what you essentially do the days before and what you don't do the last few days. And then of course here in regards to sodium and everything else. Oh, and hang on, where did we go? And supplementation. So yeah, I think this is an awesome overview. If anyone ever wants to dip their feet into guiding someone through a contest prep or wants to even just trial things on their own. I mean, it doesn't have to be a proper peak week or so, but yeah, thought it was interesting. And then for the competition day, so subjective appearance and perception of the physique for the previous, and other means of assessing stage readiness. Of course, the goals of peak week is to minimize subcutaneous water, as mentioned earlier, and to ensure intramuscular triglycerides and skeletal muscle glycogen stores are maximized, and putting the muscle bellies in full relief and displaying maximal muscularity. That should largely be accomplished before the day of the competition. In bodybuilding, what? Vernacular? I don't actually even know what that.
Language. In bodybuilding vernacular, it's like bodybuilding language.
Oh, okay. So lingo, right. Gotcha.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for that. In bodybuilding vernacular, these components of muscularity could be considered dryness or lack of subcutaneous fluid and fullness. The muscle cell fuel stores are full, repleted, or supercompensated. However, some fine-tuning is often necessary to optimize the physique's appearance when being judged. So here we have someone who is looking dry or flat, and someone who's looking, or here where he's looking full. At least that's what the description said when I looked for it. I don't know, Mike, if you would agree with that. But so this is a less desirable look for a stage appearance than this over here. Of course, the lighting is kind of different too, but he does look, I do think he does look fuller, and the word even makes sense when we talk about dryness or flat, and this one being full. Yeah, Mike, as someone who's currently or who's also a judge or potential judge, what would you say to this?
Yeah, no, I'd totally agree with that. Like you said, on the image on the left, like you said, you can see he's very lean. You can see he's very dry. But on the image of on the right, his like particularly if you look at his shoulders and his chest, they kind of pop out at you a little bit more. They're kind of a bit more obvious and in your face, um, unlike the other one. So that would kind of be, yeah, that would be kind of how I tell the difference more or less.
Yeah, I think even on the ab section, like even though he almost looks leaner on the left picture, it's definitely less like the right one just looks fuller. Full is really the best way to put it. I think absolutely.
Exactly.
Um,
And it sometimes, I know it's a little bit probably not exactly the same because of the lighting is slightly different, but it does bring out in some cases the details. Like if you look at his upper chest, you can see like a tiny little bit more detail in his chest. So
mm,
in some situations, it can just help to bring out because the muscle is fuller. Again, it's bringing out the details that are there, but you just can't see them, sort of thing.
yeah, absolutely. I do like the tiger print purse in the background there.
Mm.
That's clearly his.
Exactly what Melissa was focusing on. That and the tan is, you can see the tan. So I don't know what happened with the sock in this one.
Right. And then we have the opposite. So here he is quote unquote spilled over. So too many carbs that, pull more water. It doesn't necessarily just have to be because of the carbs, but more water was pulled into the extracellular space. So he is looking spilled over in this one, and this one would be a perfect peak from what this picture says and from what I can see. But yeah, again, Mike, what would be your comment on this?
Yeah, and again, like I think it's a good example. Like for if you look at the image on the right, you can see that his waist just looks tighter, and also the definition in his abdominals is a lot clearer and more visible. It's probably hard to say because of the tattoo on his arm, but I imagine you'd probably see again like slightly cleaner lines and separation in his probably delts and arms. But the midsection is just like a total giveaway in terms of the detail and the kind of how sort of slim and tight his waist looks on the right. So yeah, I think it's a good example.
Yeah, and I think it's also quite visible that it's not that he has more body fat on that one as like necessarily or at all, because I mean you still clearly see the six pack and everything else, but it's just you can see it doesn't look as sharp or as
Mm,
hard as in the right picture. So I think that's kind of the main thing. It's not that he's not ready yet, his condition isn't there yet, or so it's literally a matter of something having gone wrong with the carb, water, sodium
mm,
dosage, I guess, during the week.
mm,
Okay, cool. And I also liked this little graphic that they had in there when you're like thinking about are you too full, are you dry, etc. And you can kind of like, or as a coach, you can go through this and then thinking of what should I be doing to clean things up or to still get there if the day before I don't quite look the way that I want to look or should be looking. Yeah, what are your guys's thoughts on the whole paper? And I just noted sodium and water there because I do think it's super interesting. And I until last year I never tracked my sodium intake, where for a few days I was just like curious. Okay, I wonder how much salt I actually consume in a day. And then I was like, oh, this is okay. This is 6 grams or whatever. And a few days I played around with water and stuff, and it really is crazy how much you can manipulate with just those teeny tiny variables without changing anything else, or maybe carbs, but aside from that, not much else.
As somebody totally outside of the bodybuilding world and working with clients who are also outside of that, it makes me think of the days that we look in the mirror and go, why am I so fluffy today? Because there's so much going on in the background that we are unaware of in terms of hydration and sodium and all of that that we just talked about. It would be there's so many answers to that question, but it makes it so obvious why some days we feel so fluffy and other days we don't. We feel like, oh, there's my abs. It's just an interesting observation, I guess.
100%. And I mean, I think a lot of people are aware of like, oh, yesterday I went to the Chinese buffet and I had a crap ton of sodium in that meal. That's why I'm feeling so bloated or whatever. But oftentimes we also eat things that we don't consciously think have that much sodium in them, or we think, oh, I might have drank a little bit less, but it's not going to make that big of a difference. But then you don't consider that at the same time your carb intake was higher, or like whatever it might be. As you say, there's just so many variables. And I think looking at this, I can 100% understand why, especially in the last few weeks leading up to competition day, you do want your athlete or yourself to eat mostly the same things so that when something is not working the way that you want it to, you know exactly what to manipulate. If you eat something different every single day, you don't know if it's the extra fiber, 5 grams of fiber that you had. Is it because there was a little bit more salt in this and that? So like if you just eat your, classic chicken, rice, and broccoli, and your potatoes and fish and spinach and stuff for a few weeks, at least you know why it is about. Melissa, we're not talking about enjoying food here. This is a sport, right? So you need to differentiate that. This is not something that people, where people are, thinking about, yeah, I want to have the most delicious meal ever. This is just about getting to their goal. So yeah. Anyway, any other thoughts?
I think when I was reading the section on sodium manipulation, it just made me think that actually there's so many complicated mechanisms within the body that do you know what? It is always better to keep it simple because, it's probably going to be luck if you get it right. And, so most of the time you're better off keeping it simple and, going from there. And I think it really outlined a lot of, near fatal examples where people tried to meddle with it and actually they nearly got it horribly wrong. So,
Mm,
yeah, I think it was just a really good example of actually there are some things which make sense, like carbohydrate and fat loading, but with other things like sodium, it's probably safer to err on the side of, keep things relatively stable unless you've done it lots of times before and you're confident in your approach. Like someone like Cliff Wilson, who's probably done
right,
it with hundreds of athletes, yeah, sure, he'd probably be confident in doing what he's doing, but maybe someone like me or someone else, I'd probably keep things simple.
right. Yeah, and if I'm not mistaken, he actually even had some interesting approaches in terms of potassium manipulation as well, which I was like, whoa, okay, now we're getting into even more of a tricky territory. But I mean, if someone's not afraid to like go into super high dosages of carbs or intakes of carbs and whatever, then they're not afraid to manipulate potassium also. But I think it's more, it becomes more dangerous when we're also talking about yeah, diuretics and whatnot, what people have been taken in the past, especially in those earlier days of bodybuilding, I guess.
I
But yeah,
think
even
that's
if
a
that's, oh, sorry, Kim.
I was just going to say, I think that's a really good point. With manipulating sodium and water is really scary and serious. And you have to take that seriously and know what you're doing because you can literally die if you mess that up. So people just trying this for the first time, maybe going in on their own. I don't know. I think that's a little bit scary. And I always think of this. There was some silly radio station contest that they had in Sacramento. I think it's a pretty famous case all over the world that they were challenging people who could drink the most water quickly and then you would win a prize or whatever. And there was a woman who drank like a full gallon in just a couple of minutes and she literally died of hyponatremia. So like that's scary stuff. You have to know what you're doing and you have to be really careful with that.
Really, really good point. I do hope that most people stepping on stage do have at least a coach, and hopefully these days also the coaches are improving in quality. So, I mean, yes, hopefully. But yeah, even if this was like kind of outside of at least what we normally talk about, I hope it was somewhat insightful or interesting. Um, any final thoughts? Otherwise, I think we'll leave it at that. Anything else? No? Okay. Cool. Well, thank you everybody for listening in or watching, and I hope you have a nice rest of your day or evening. I'll be sending out next week's article soon.
Perfect. Thanks, Lisa. Thanks, everyone.
Bye. Bye.